Roads? Where we're going, we don't need roads.
Birds in Pokemon are a really unique category. Pokemon's trend of creating a new regional bird for every different generation, as well as the variety of birds that they also include, makes it so that this is one of the largest groups in the whole of the chart. Similar to the bug and fish groups that I've already discussed, the birds are mostly made up of one specific type, this being the flying type. However, it's nowhere near as monotyped as these two groups. There are a lot of birds that aren't flying types, and there are a lot of flying types that aren't birds. If you haven't checked out the last video, we went through the reptiles and amphibians. Most people know that modern day birds are descended from reptiles. In my chart, this breakoff point comes with the unnamed Zolt Pokemon, being the Pokemon that makes up half of Arctozolt and Dracozolt. I hadn't actually included this Pokemon or any of the Generation 8 fossils in my last video, however they would all take their places in this part of the tree. The Zolt Pokemon is clearly some type of raptor, and it's not hard to see that with its small body and it being so closely related to birds, why archaeologists would have named this the bird fossil. In this part of the chart, I also had to add another group, dragons. The main difference that I decided between dragons and birds are the development of wings which are separate to their arms. Take Druddigon, Charizard or Dragonite. None of their wings are closely connected to their arms, like they would be on a bird. They also haven't developed feathers like a bird has, and have instead kept scaly on the outside. Pokemon and the real world both share the same ancestor bird, Archeops or the Archaeopteryx. In real life, this is considered to be the transition point between bird and dinosaur, hence why Archeops is a prehistoric Pokemon and why it learned so many dragon moves. That being said, there aren't many differences between birds and other reptiles. The main ones are obviously wings and feathers. Birds developed feathers as a way of improving their aerodynamics in flying. They also provide them with a lot of waterproofing and heatproofing, something which the mostly terrestrial dinosaurs wouldn't need as much. You can really see the connections between birds and dinosaurs through the two large flightless birds of Pokemon, Espathra and Dodrio. The ostriches and emus that they're based on are essentially raptors without separate arms. They're incredibly deadly. Because of the environments that they've developed in, mostly in the southern hemisphere, they don't need to worry about flying as much due to their large size. These birds can essentially take on whatever predator they want. They're like tanks with feathers, just as the Australian military. I'm not a big fan of the next Pokemon because they're quite foul. Sorry guys, that was a paltry attempt at a joke there.
Oh brother, this guy stinks!
The foul birds that we get are mostly the birds that we eat. It's divided into two groups, Anseriforms and Galliforms. Galliforms are made of chickens and their descendants, pheasants and peacocks, or what we would call game fowl. All of the Galliforms can fly, but are not very well known for it. Chickens that we now see have been domesticated, hence why in this group there is only one flying type, Unpheasant. You might question why Quaquaval is part of this group when it looks a lot like a duck. Well, I think that while it evolves from ducks, it actually shares a lot more in common with a peacock. Its particular plumage and theming around flamboyance really indicate towards this, as this is a common trope of peacocks in culture. The true waterfowl live in the Anseriform category. This is where we find the singular swan Pokemon and all of the ducks of Pokemon. Golduck may look a lot like a platypus, but I've included it here, alongside Ludicolo, who is a kappa but is extremely duck-like, so this is where I'm putting it. Returning back to the main branch, we get Flamigo with no clear relations. I'm not even sure if Flamigo should go on this list. It's just a real life flamingo with a knot in its head. I'm glad I don't have to talk about it anymore. The further down we get, we can see that size becomes much less important for these birds. Instead, we get a lot more specialization in the types of birds. That can't be said for Pidgeot, however, who is clearly some sort of pigeon, but is just the generic bird. Its closest relative would therefore be Togekiss, a dove. I debated whether or not to talk about Togekiss as a dove, but I decided it didn't fit anywhere else on this group, and it has a lot of theming around love, and so do doves. Zapdos is another bird that's very confusing. It's based off a thunderbird, but that isn't a real type of bird, just a mythological animal. If its Galarian form stood on its own, it would clearly go with Espathra and Dodrio in the large flightless bird category, but it doesn't. Zapdos itself looks like a hummingbird, although an absolutely massive version of a hummingbird. I've included it here as I'm going off the original forms for regional variants, with the exception of Hisui, as Hisuian Pokemon clearly came before their modern counterparts. As we go to the right of this chart, we move on to the water birds. The bottom half of this includes all of the birds with really large bills. Here we get the storks, cormorants and pelicans of Pokemon. This group also surprisingly includes Moltres. Moltres is probably some sort of heron or cormorant, so it goes here despite literally being on fire. The top half of this category includes the much larger birds. This would be where we would find an albatross Pokemon, if there was one. Albatrosses have the largest wingspan of any flying birds and are absolutely massive. The closest equivalent that we have in Pokemon is Kilowattrel, a petrel. This group also includes the penguins, who have adapted to water instead of the air. Penguins don't fly, so can be a lot bigger. They also need to be streamlined for water and take on the many threats that face them under the sea. On the other part of this chart, we see the birds of prey of Pokemon. These have focused a lot more on power, size and speed rather than any particular specializations. This group includes the owls. Decidueye and Noctowl are obviously owls, but Aromatisse is also here. Aromatisse is based off a plague doctor, and I'm not 100% sure that it is a bird. Its face could very well just be a mask, but the feathers do indicate that it is some sort of avian animal. Owl is probably the best fit for it, judging by its big eyes, and as Bulbapedia points out, it looks a lot like the owlbear from Dungeons & Dragons. The more traditional birds of prey include Hawlucha the hawk and Braviary, who is an eagle. It's also where we get the New World vultures. As the name suggests, these are found in America. They're a completely different group from the Old World vultures, who are more closely related to the hawks and eagles. Mandibuzz is a very traditional representation of a vulture, but condors are also technically New World vultures. Fearow and Skarmory are probably condors, so they go in here, although Fearow does have a lot of elements of a chicken about it. Branching off on the other part of the tree, we have Xatu and Articuno. These Pokemon are both Quetzals, a type of bird known for their really bright colours, and can often be confused with parrots. We also get Toucanon, the only Picoform of Pokemon. Picoforms actually include woodpeckers as well, so it's not too far-fetched that a woodpecker becomes a toucan in Pokemon. One Pokemon you may think would fit with the birds of prey would be Talonflame. Talonflame is a falcon, particularly a peregrine falcon judging by its markings and emphasis on being really quick. The peregrine falcon is the fastest animal in the world, and it's actually a lot closer to the songbirds and parrots of the world than it is an eagle. Within the parrots, we'd obviously have Chatot and Squawkabilly, but I've also included Altaria. Whilst Altaria is a dragon type, I don't think that it is a dragon. It's very clearly a bird, but what type of bird is it? Well, have a look at its face. It's very similar to a cockatiel, a type of parrot that's often used as a pet. The next group are called passerines. They're defined by the arrangement of their toes that allow them to easily grab hold of things. They have 3 toes on the front and 1 at the back. Within this grouping, we have the songbirds. Oricorio probably has the claim to being the most important Pokemon in the whole of the chart. Oricorio is certainly based off a finch, in particular a Galapagos finch. If you've ever done any sort of biology class ever, you probably know the story of how the Galapagos finch helped inspire Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Along the different Galapagos islands, different finches had different beaks depending on what was most abundant on those islands. The finches there had adapted and evolved to their environment, laying the basis for the theory of evolution. This grouping also includes Staraptor, a starling, who references back to the reptilian origins of the bird Pokemon. It's also meant to include Swallow, who is a swallow, but has been put on the wrong part of the list. The final grouping that we'll cover in the birds are the corvids. This is where we find Corviknight and Horned Crow. Corvids are probably the smartest and most developed of all of the birds. There's a lot of evidence of them using tools, something which we only really see in primates. In the Pokemon world, they even have jobs. Corviknight is a taxi driver, whilst Horned Crow works in waste management. Those are all the birds of the Pokemon world. As you can see, this chart is pretty much done. If you want to see more videos on this chart, please consider liking or subscribing. Thank you.